Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about the history of Christianity after the first century. We've kind of gotten through the end of the first century, and this will be kind of an abbreviated history, but just want to cover some of the major events, especially events that solidified doctrines that many people believe today as a basic matter of faith, and also doctrines that have caused divisions within Christianity over the years. You probably know we have three major kinds of Christianity. We have what we call Roman Catholicism, and we also have the Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and other factors. The Orthodox Church was the Greek-speaking church, and of course the whole New Testament was written in Greek. The Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church split in 1054, though there were tensions before that. The Roman Catholic Church had translated the entire Greek New Testament into Latin, and believed that Latin was, for some reason, God's preferred language. And it was about 500 years after this, in the 16th century, that the Protestant Reformation is born, which is another major form of Christianity. So we've got the three: the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Protestant. And there are obviously many varieties of Protestantism, many varieties of Christianity that do not consider themselves a part of the Catholic Church or a part of the Orthodox Church. We'll talk a little bit about this, but I mainly want to just talk about the main events throughout history that caused Christianity to really kind of work out exactly what it believed about certain issues. And let's start with something we talked about all the way back when we talked about dualisms. If you remember, we talked about dualisms, and there's one that we talked about called spirit-matter dualism. And by the way, the video is still there, and if you want to go back and review what we said about spirit-matter dualism, you certainly can. But one of the things that maybe you'll remember is that there are none of the major world religions today that embrace spirit-matter dualism. None do. And when I say spirit-matter dualism, I mean that matter, all physical form, is seen as being evil, is seen as being evil manifestation. It's part of the creation of an evil deity that actually is trying to destroy us as the children of God, as it were. None of the religions today believe this, but from about 2,500 years ago to about 1,500 years ago, these kind of teachings were very popular. And today we have a term for them. We normally call them Gnosticism. And gnosis is the Greek word, starts with a silent G, G-N-O-S-I-S, is the Greek word for knowledge, not just everyday knowledge, but some kind of a higher knowledge, philosophical knowledge, a spiritual knowledge, something like that. And so the Gnostics claim to have received some kind of a spiritual revelation of the fact that they were purely spiritual beings, and that this entire physical existence was something to be eschewed and rejected and seen as being evil. And we mentioned a little bit of this when we were talking about the dualisms. While there were many different forms of these spirit-matter dualistic philosophies / religions that today fall in the category of Gnosticism, they have some things in common. And the first, as I mentioned, is this idea that there is some experience of divine knowledge that opens you up to the idea that you really are a spiritual being. And what goes along with this is some kind of an understanding that the material world was created by a lesser god or an evil god. And you might often hear this say, the evil demiurgos. Demiurgos is not necessarily evil. It is a philosophical concept. But what the Gnostics have done is they've taken the idea of the demiurgos and made the demiurgos an evil creator. And so this material world was created by an evil detractor from God, who was trying to destroy his spirit children by causing them to be born in a material world, causing them to be born in material bodies, so that they would forget who they are, and accepting their identity, as it would appear to be, and living like material beings, then they will die like material beings, and that's the end of them. But there is a salvation available, and that is through this special transformative experience of the reality that in fact we are spiritual beings, and that this whole material world is inferior. And so what are you supposed to do? How do you respond to this? Well, you want to live your life reminding yourself day to day that this physical life, including your own physical body, everything, this is all evil. It is the evil creation of an evil, inferior God, and we should not live like this is reality, and we should not live like this is the reality of who we are either. We should try to live like the spiritual beings we are. Now, among different Gnostic groups, there were a number of different ways to respond to this. They didn't all respond the same way. Some of them, felt like they should deny the flesh and not fulfill, the fleshly lusts, but should get free of this bondage to the flesh, as you might call it. Then there were other groups that believed that once you really had embraced your spiritual identity and you weren't bound to the flesh, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted because the body didn't matter anyway. So radically different ways of responding to this, but they all had the one thing in common, that it was this divine revelation, that you're a spiritual being. And there's some kind of a creation story that goes along with a lot of them, and that is that originally we're the spirit children of the Spirit Father, pure spirit, but this evil lesser deity, evil demiurgos or whatever, created the world of matter and imprisoned the spirit children in these bodies of flesh so we would forget who we are. And so obviously salvation is realizing that we're spiritual beings, identifying with that, and taking whatever steps the individual religion or philosophical group would tell you are necessary to fully embrace this spiritual identity. And the hope is that when you die, your spirit will be set free from the physical body that has died. Your spirit won't die, but your spirit will go back to the Spirit Father and become free again for all eternity. Now, before I go on with the doctrine, let me just explain the problem here. The problem here is that there are apparently a number of these groups that have found the teachings of Jesus to be very interesting and have actually adapted some of them. And when I say adapted, they seem to have a different interpretation of them than Jesus's first generation of disciples. And these teachings seem to be uniformly rejected by Jesus's first disciples. Though 200 or 300 years later, there are a number of Gnostic documents. You might have heard of some of them, which I don't really have too much time to talk about now, unfortunately, but you might have heard of the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas. And obviously these documents are using the names of original disciples, but it's extremely unlikely that they were written by those disciples. In fact, it's extremely unlikely that they were written within a couple hundred years of when those disciples lived. All of our evidence seems to be that this doctrine was rejected. Why would they reject this doctrine? Well, as we said, first of all, the teachings of Jesus, or I should say the conclusion of Jesus's teachings and parables and so on, was changed by them a lot to correlate with their beliefs. And by the time you turn Jesus into someone who is saying only spirit is good and all matter is evil, you've really changed an awful lot of his message. First of all, who created the world? Well, according to the Gnostics, it was an evil God. Well, what does the Bible say? In Genesis, it says that God created the world, the good God. And by the way, the world wasn't evil. When he got done, he beheld, and it was good. It was good. So getting away from this idea that the world is evil here, beyond that, the idea that this evil world was made by a lesser God. So if you had a group of Gnostics, for instance, that were looking at Jesus and comparing him to the Torah, comparing him to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, they would say that the God that created this world is the evil demiurgos that the Son of the Spirit Father came to set us free from. So you've already got this tremendous conflict here where now the Old Testament is like, this is the evil God working. That's a big problem. Second problem is this: if all matter is evil, then the Son of God could not have become flesh. Because if you became flesh, if you became material, you'd be making yourself evil. And, the Spirit Son of the Father, can't do that. And so there's a lot of different ways that different philosophers thought of this creative force or communicating force of God, whether it's the logos, the word, whether it's the nous, the mind of God, the creative force. But Gnostics all agreed that this was purely a spiritual being, no material aspect to their existence. Now, there seem to be a couple different versions of this. One of them is, you won't be asked this, but it is really kind of pure docetism, which is that Jesus is completely divine. There's nothing physical about him at all. And in fact, he doesn't have a physical body. But the reason you see him and you hear him, and if he touches you, you can feel him, is because he has the power to mess with your senses and cause himself to appear as a physical being so he can communicate with you. But that's all an illusion. He's not physical at all. He's purely spiritual. And the other version of it is that somehow this purely spiritual Son of God somehow possessed the body of this guy Jesus of Nazareth and worked through his body, but never really joined with him in a way that Jesus's material nature would defile the true Son of God. And these are two different versions of this. But the point is, the Son of God can't be physical, or he'd be defiled. Well, this also directly conflicts with the whole gospel story. The whole gospel story is it's a real physical woman, who is miraculously impregnated by God, really goes into labor, really has a physical baby, and his name is Jesus, and he grows up to be the Messiah. And eventually, he actually endures great pain and finally physically dies hanging on a cross. But it gets worse for the Gnostics, and that is he's buried in the ground, and on the third day, his body actually is somehow glorified and comes out of the grave again. Now, this is the standard, gospel story. And no self-respecting Gnostic would ever want their body back. The idea is to get free from your body altogether. You don't want it out of the grave. You want to be pure spirit and leave that rotting body in the grave. But all the Gospels are that somehow Jesus' body was transformed and came out of the grave. According to the Gospels, he is a physical being, and he feels pain. He has to eat food. He has to sleep. He gets really tired and discouraged at times, and he finally dies painfully. Gnostics, they cannot accept this version. They have to change everything and to make it work. And the idea of, Jesus like giving his life as a payment for sin or something, this is something that it doesn't mean anything to them at all, really. But Jesus definitely is not physical. Never died, never suffered on the cross. Some of them say that it was someone else that was actually mistaken for him, that, maybe our senses were tweaked so that we thought it was him, or with the other version where the body of Jesus of Nazareth was being possessed by this guy. Well, then, of course, the Spirit Son had left the body before it was put on the cross. Or anyway, there was all kinds of ways of looking at this, but these are the reasons it was rejected, because Jesus was supposed to have become flesh, and as a fleshly man, he is supposed to have suffered and died to be an offering for the sins of humanity, so that all of the sins of humanity could be forgiven. So, how do we know that this is, it's the earliest doctrinal controversy in Christianity that makes it into the record. And it's the earliest one because we can even see it being refuted in the New Testament in the writings of an apostle named John, who is one of the 12 disciples, also one of the inner three. Remember, James and John were the sons of Zebedee. This is that John. And in his gospel, he writes about the creation of the world, and he uses a lot of Stoic terminology, talking about the logos, the word of God, or the communication of God, the creative force of God, and that somehow God created the world through the logos, and that Jesus was the logos. And, it's sounding pretty nice and Gnostic until you get down to verse 14. And in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, when you get down to 1:14, after the word, the logos, has been turned into this, deified creator, then John says, the word, the logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, that's the most non-Gnostic thing or anti-Gnostic thing you can possibly say. And this, by the way, is the term sarx in the Greek, which literally means the body of flesh. It doesn't just mean a body, because you could have a spiritual body, a material body. You can use that symbolically in many ways, but flesh, means this carbon-based stuff that's going to rot in the grave. And so when it says the logos became flesh, at that point you've lost every Gnostic reading it. Oh no, couldn't become flesh. And so John's making it clear. Now, John also writes 3 letters. We have 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And in 1 John, in the 4th chapter, he talks about this again. Now, what's interesting is this may have actually been written before the Gospel of John, probably was. But he says, dear friends, don't believe, every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. So here we are talking about false prophecy. This is huge, okay? That implies that there are people who are claiming to be inspired, but they're inspired by the wrong spirit and they're preaching lies. So this is already happening while the Bible is still being written. They have this understanding. And so this is what John is writing. And by the way, it's what's called a general letter. It's going to a whole bunch of churches. And it says, this is how you can recognize the Spirit of God, the real Spirit of God. Every spirit, that means every person, the Spirit in every person, every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. And again, here's this word sarx again. Everyone who acknowledges that Jesus, the Son of God, the Logos, whatever, was born and became flesh, this is true. This is good doctrine. This is the Spirit of God. But everyone that doesn't acknowledge this is not from God. And he goes on to say that this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and is even now already in the world. Now, Antichrist at this point is about the most anti-God thing you can possibly call anybody. This is the direct opponent of not only the Messiah, but the work that God did through this in redeeming people. So calling someone Antichrist is not saying you've made a mistake or will agree to disagree. Calling you Antichrist is saying you are literally fighting against God. And there's another place in 1 John, actually a couple chapters earlier, where he says, even now many antichrists have come. And this is how we know we're in the last days. Of course, we talked about the delayed parousia and how that understanding changed a bit. But he says they went out from us, but they were not really of us. For if they really had been part of us, they would have remained with us. But their going out revealed that none of them really belonged to us, was really part of us. So, he's talking about a powerful spirit of deception here. And he's saying, here's your first clue. If someone doesn't claim that the Messiah, the Son of God, became flesh, they're out of here. So this is a direct refutation of Gnosticism. Now, why is Gnosticism not mentioned? Simply because it's a new term. It's a term that we coined fairly recently to deal with any of these spirit matter religious philosophical groups that don't exist anymore. So this is the first doctrinal conflict in Christianity, and there actually is a creed called the Apostles' Creed. I'm going to put myself in the corner here, and the Apostles' Creed is an early creed that specifically refutes Gnosticism. If you listen or read the Apostles' Creed, every step of it, talking about how Jesus was born, of a physical woman, and physically died, and his body physically came out of the grave, and his body physically rose to heaven. These are all just absolutely anti-Gnostic declarations, and so what they're saying is this is the Apostles' Creed. If you're a true apostle of Jesus, you believe this creed, and this creed is just as anti-Gnostic as you can get. So this is the first doctrinal controversy here. Now, by the way, let me just go back for a second to this first page. You already know this. Christianity began as a Messianic sect of late Second Temple Judaism. They were all Torah-observant Jews. There was no attempt to start a new religion, but it's later that Christianity, as we call it today, becomes the religion of Gentile, non-Jewish followers of Jesus. Their understanding of covenant is very different. Their understanding of Jesus is more like a God-man coming to save them, more like Greek mythology, and certainly not like some Mashiach that is going to come and fulfill a covenant promise from God, because they weren't part of that covenant. So they have a very different idea, as we mentioned before. We talked about the two main rituals in early Christianity. We've talked about the initiation ritual, the maintenance ritual. We've talked about what they are, where they came from, when they were initiated, and who initiated them. So I'm not going to go over that again. In 313 CE. Now, what's happened here is Christianity has been persecuted sporadically, but there's been a couple of major persecutions under Domitian and Diocletian. And finally, in 305, I believe it is, we have Constantine, who actually becomes emperor and solidifies his control over the Roman Empire. And he's had a vision, and he actually believes that Jesus has helped him to get the victory because he's the one that's supposed to be the emperor. And this is pretty notable because Christianity hasn't even been a legal religion up until this point. But Constantine has this religious experience, and so he's very friendly to Christianity. In fact, he gives Jesus some glory for helping him to become the emperor. And in 313, less than a decade after he becomes emperor, he authors this Edict of Milan, or it's sometimes called the Edict of Toleration, making Christianity a legal religion. So from 313 on, cannot be persecuted anymore. This is only just a very few decades from one of the worst persecutions that existed here. Now, at this point, Christian leaders all over the world can openly debate about key doctrines of the faith. They don't have to be scared anymore of being persecuted. And so the most important topic of debate was concerning the divinity and pre-existence of Jesus. Now, what's happened here is over, a couple, 3 centuries, many different viewpoints have grown and developed in different parts of the Roman Empire. We have some radically different ideas here. As far as the divinity of Jesus, there are some who believe that Jesus is literally equal to the Father. In fact, one of the groups is, they're called patripassionists. And when they say patri, that's Father, passion is the suffering. In other words, in Jesus, the Father God was actually suffering and dying on the cross. And that's just a complete equality. And so patripassionists believe that. Also, Sabellians believe that, if you ever heard that term. Then on the other side, we have people that are a lot more adoptionist. And by the way, adoptionist is a lot closer to the way Jews would have seen it when the Holy Spirit empowers someone, falls upon them, and they're given the power and given the abilities to fulfill something that God is calling them to do. And they really saw this Spirit of God falling on Jesus. And, maybe in the final analysis, Jesus is exalted to a place of deity. He is exalted to a place of being the judge of all humanity. They're not denying that. But they're saying that Jesus, even himself, was at some point created by God. And at some point, this man, was anointed. In fact, there is an Alexandrian bishop named Arius, who, in the course of arguing for this way of thinking, made a very, very important statement that was oft repeated. And the statement literally is, there was when the Son was not. And what that means is there once was a time when the Son did not exist, thus affirming that Jesus himself was a creation of God that began to be at some point in time. At least that's the way it would be taken. Well, there was a big argument about this, and a lot of people rejected this. So Constantine in 325, here we are another 12 years later, doesn't want Christianity all fighting among itself. So he calls all these bishops from all over the empire to the Council of Nicaea to resolve the issue. And the council ends up coming up with what's called the Nicene Creed. Now, there was a lot of wrangling. And not only were there many different ideas and no unanimous outcome, really, but even the fact that some people spoke Greek and some spoke Latin was a real problem, too, because they were using correlating words in different ways, in different senses. And I won't get into the whole thing, but it was quite a debate. And at the end, they came to a conclusion, but it was far from a unanimous conclusion where everybody said, we feel the same way about this. In fact, in 380, a little later, as you see, we have to, I think it's 381, the Creed of Constantinople. They have to clarify some other things, but this is still never really agreed upon. When we get to the split between Roman Catholics and the Greek-speaking Orthodox Church in 1054, 700 years later, there are still disagreements related to this Nicene Creed that are cited in terms of the split at that point in time. But essentially, what ends up, the majority case, what ends up is that Jesus, to be a Christian, this is important to understand, there's one church, there's only one church. You can't go down the street and join another one. So the official doctrine of the church becomes that if you are going to be a Christian, if you're going to be saved, you must believe that Jesus is equal with God the Father, that he's fully divine, that he has no beginning and no end, and the Holy Spirit starts entering into the saying too, but not as defined as it's going to be in the future, because the big conflict here wasn't in how to understand the Holy Spirit. It was to understand the relationship of the Son and the Father. But the Holy Spirit does come out of this as being divine as well. We're starting to come up with the idea of the Trinity, that God is in three persons, but they're all somehow equally God. And there will be many later doctrinal discussions about how to understand the Trinity as well. So we're just getting started with this. Now the problem is, every time something like this happens, a creed, whoever wins, they're the ones that were truly of God. But the problem is, the people who had a different idea to start with, they might have been faithful Christians. They might have been good people. They just had a different understanding. But by the time the creeds are enacted and the councils are over, they are declared to be heretics that are going to burn in hell forever, and they're cast out of the church because they didn't win the argument, if you will. A lot of the things that we call heresy weren't always heresy. They were just things that a big knockdown, drag-out type discussion happened with, and the winners basically ostracized and excommunicated the losers and condemned them. So 313, Christianity is a legal religion. 325, we have a uniform creedal statement for all of Christianity that is endorsed by the emperor Constantine. In 380, a later emperor, Theodosius, actually made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, thus making paganism, not the preferred religion anymore. And so from this point on, the Roman agenda to expand the empire, which it very much was trying to, and the Christian agenda to evangelize the whole world, they become intertwined. And this is a very important and interesting aspect of Christian history. Wish I had more time to talk about it. But this is where Christianity and the whole idea of taking the gospel to every part of the world and the Roman goal of political domination, this is where the theological and the political and the evangelization and the colonization, they all get completely mixed up. And it's the beginning of a very complicated history in Christianity. All right, let's move on here to the next page. All right, on this next page, we're going to talk a little bit about Augustine, or Augustine if you like, who is a great theologian of this period. He was originally a Gnostic. He was a Manichae. He was into Manichaeism. This was a very popular form of Gnosticism. He was involved for 9 years and was disillusioned with Christianity and with Judaism too, because the God of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, doesn't seem to be a very righteous God. He finally works out his problems in this regard because there is a bishop that introduces him to the idea that these stories are allegories, that they are stories that are supposed to represent, spiritual warfare on our own lives and all kinds of other things. It's not just some historical tale, but they represent a different meaning. And this makes it easier, I guess, for Augustine to accept some of these things that at first offended him, because it seemed like this God wasn't a very righteous God. So once he does become a believer, he crafts some pretty in-depth theologies, and the one on the Trinity is probably the most famous. The doctrine is not new to Augustine because, of course, we've been talking about this before, but he substantially develops it. And one thing that's interesting to know is that he syncretizes Neo-Platonist theology with Christian doctrine. Now, all the way back in the time of Plato is talking about the invisible world of forms that somehow are the essence or the model for everything that exists. But over Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism, the doctrine has developed quite a bit. And we're getting to like the three emanations of God. And so Augustine takes a lot of these ideas and kind of syncretizes them to some degree, at least uses them for a platform to understand the Trinity here. And so this is an interesting intersection with philosophy. And remember here, Augustine is preferring Platonism. There actually is a student of Plato named Aristotle who has some very different views about some things. And at this point, the church is really kind of embracing Plato's philosophy, Platonic philosophy, or some people say Platonic philosophy, more than the Aristotelian philosophy. And Aristotle ends up being largely rejected. His philosophy ends up being rejected, at least rejected as something that could be used by the church to better understand the nature of God and the Trinity. And interestingly enough, we'll talk more about this, because since the church really kind of rejected Aristotle, they didn't preserve his writings. In fact, there are many cases where they were deliberately destroyed. Libraries were burned that had them because they considered his teachings to be heresy. because he had a difference of opinion from Plato, and Plato was the philosophy that best lent itself to the doctrine of the Trinity. We're not quite done with Aristotle yet. We're going to find out later on. He makes a comeback. There's another thing that Augustine is famous for, and that is the doctrine of predestinarianism. Sometimes people just call it predestination. And this divides Christianity theologically to this day. What ends up happening is he ends up having a doctrinal controversy with a guy named Pelagius. And Pelagius believes that we're all kind of born as empty slates. We're all born as good people and, not guilty of any sin or anything like that. And however likely or certain it will be that at some point the human is going to do something that qualifies as a sin and is going to need atonement, the human being born doesn't really need it at that time because the human being born hasn't done anything wrong at that time. And there's a certain amount of time until what we might call the age of accountability. The whole idea, though, that humans were born good, Augustine doesn't believe that at all. Augustine does not believe that we by our own power can make a choice to do anything good. He believes that we're born with a sin disease that's been passed on by our parents. It's inevitable that we are going to rebel, and we cannot even make a choice to free ourselves from this tendency. We don't have the power. Not only do we not have the power to change ourselves, we don't even have the power to make the choice to change ourselves. This is completely the result of God's grace. Not just God's grace in helping us to have this transformation, but even making the choice that we will submit to God is a gift of God's grace, because if God didn't do a miracle, we could not even make that decision. Now, Augustine understands this doctrine largely because of his own experience. And in his own experience, he felt like a supernatural transformation was necessary before he could even try to obey God's word or please God. I mean, he needed this empowering, and even the decision to follow God was a gift of grace. He believed that our wills were bound by sin, and God had to actually set your will free so that you could make a decision to follow him. And the reason for this is because Augustine, this gives all the glory to God. It doesn't give you credit for anything, and that's the way Augustine believed it should be. See, even if I say, well, at least I chose to follow Jesus, I'm taking credit for something. Maybe God made it possible for me to be holy and change me miraculously, but even if I say that I had the power to make the decision, I can at least take credit for that. And Augustine's saying, no, you didn't even have the power to make the decision. That was a miracle in itself that God set your will free so you can make the power for the decision. And so he doesn't want humans to have any glory for anything whatsoever. You can't take any credit for everything. All glory goes to God. Now, this whole doctrinal controversy goes before the Council of Orange, and Augustine is largely the winner. Now, everything I've said so far, he gets over with. But there's a part of Augustine's teaching that comes out of this that isn't completely accepted by the Council of Orange, but it's a lot more accepted than his adversary, Pelagius, who is now, of course, determined to be a heretic, and everyone who believed his doctrine, Pelagianism, is determined to be a heretic, because that's the way it turns out. But the idea that they had the hardest time with, even though Augustine was the clear winner, was the idea of predestinarianism. And that is that people are predestined to be saved, to be lost, whatever, because if they were not predestined, then that would mean that they had some control over whether they were saved or they didn't, in which case, again, they'd get some credit for something. And so following this, I don't think this was all worked out to start with. I think Augustine gets to this whole predestinarian doctrine through this whole debate. And sometimes debates just keep getting, the ramifications of these debates, we have all kinds of new issues coming up. And sometimes you have to double down on some very, very uncomfortable doctrines just to continue to make your point. So the idea of being predestined, the idea where we don't have any free will at all, this has been one of the competing doctrines in Christianity to this day, and we've talked a little bit about it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it a little bit later when we get to Calvinism, which is kind of like the first time that Augustine's doctrine is fully embraced. Again, he's the clear winner over Pelagius, but the whole idea that we have no free will at all, Council of Orange doesn't go so far as to accept that. Predestinarianism kind of goes along with original sin and total depravity, but the original sin and total depravity, that means you're born with sin, and total depravity, that means that you're incapable of making the right decision without some miracle. that's easier to accept. But the idea that what goes along with it logically is that we don't have any free will at all. It's just completely up to God who he decides to miraculously make a decision to get saved or whatever. And that's what doesn't quite go over, at least not till we get to the Protestant Reformation. And then we get some really hardcore predestinarianism. Just war is an interesting one. Just war is the idea of, when is a war righteous? Obviously, the cause you're fighting for has to be righteous. The means you're using have to be righteous. There has to be no better way, no better chance of success. And whatever suffering, whatever collateral damage happens, whatever innocent people are killed, the outcome has to be so desirable that it justifies that kind of suffering. It justifies that kind of collateral damage. Now, I've made it far too simple, and it goes far deeper than that. But the idea is, remember, Christianity is now kind of tied up with the Roman Empire, and how do empires expand? They conquer other nations and make them their vassals. And so Christianity has a long history of going to war for, Christian principles too. And it gets very difficult in some eras to separate church agendas from the political agendas of the popes or the emperors or whatever. And this has been a problem throughout the history of Christianity, as we mentioned earlier. Now, the doctrine of just war has been misused through the centuries to oppress and destroy enemies of Christianity. That was not Augustine's intent. Just war is talking more about real warfare, but the idea of saying that someone else believes something different than us, so therefore they're all worthy to be exterminated. This is a very, very real idea that is embraced later on, and that certainly was not what Augustine had in mind at the time, but it did actually get to that. And we'll talk about this in just a couple more paragraphs here. We'll come back to this idea of how this doctrine of just war is sometimes very, very badly applied. One other way it's badly applied to is in terms of persecution against the Jews. The idea that you are setting up God's kingdom and, some people have to suffer, and if they're innocent, God knows they'll be rewarded, If not, well, then they deserve what they get. When you start getting to how much Christianity is despising Judaism by this point, Judaism hasn't gone away. It's, they've been kicked out of their land, but they're spread throughout the Roman Empire, and they're still really kind of thriving. And so Christianity really wants to make sure they do not have the same civil rights. And there's a lot of ways that they're just second-class citizens, if you will. And Augustine is basically using them in a doctrine he calls the negative witness. When we say negative witness, he's saying, look at the Jew. Look at how miserable he is. Look at how they've lost everything because they didn't know when God came. And now they're as good as dead. So why are they still even here? And the answer is they're here by the mercy of God because they're left here as a warning to us, lest we should follow their own rebellion and unbelief. Wow. Now, Augustine does go on and say that you should not, persecute them or, but you know what? Once you dehumanized an entire group of people to the point to where the only reason they're alive is to show you what damnation looks like, what actions against them can you not legitimate somehow? Especially when you have doctrines like just war. So you put together just war and the doctrine of the negative witness, and these two things together were used to persecute so many Jews over the better part of 1,500, 1,600 years until the final conclusion with the Holocaust, with the Shoah. And Christianity just has a long, ugly history of severely persecuting Judaism, unfortunately. Again, Augustine, this was not his intent that his doctrine would be used this way, but this happens a lot, where doctrines that are meant to answer some important questions, the person who is creating the doctrine fails to understand in the future how this doctrine can be used or will be used in a way that they never ever intended. And there's so many doctrines like this, but the idea of just war and the idea of the negative witness are two of them that are just so misused. Just war to persecute so many different kinds of people, to try to genocidally eliminate whole groups of heretics in other countries, and to justify persecution against Jews, all kinds of stuff. So let's go on a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how this is used in a second, but I'm trying to go in historical order. In 1054, the Great Schism occurred. This is what I mentioned before, where the Western Latin-speaking Roman Church and the Eastern Greek-speaking Orthodox Church severed all ties. The Pope excommunicated the Patriarch in Constantinople, and the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope, and it was, oh, fun times. So this is the culmination of centuries of doctrinal controversy and power struggles, and some things all the way back from the Nicene Creed that still have just never really quite been agreed upon. From this point on, we're not going to talk too much about the Orthodox Church here, because they have less of an agenda to take over the entire world, and they're more minding their own business here. And also, when we talk about the birth of Protestantism, this is more just a rejection of Catholicism. It's not really a response to the Orthodox Church in any major way at all. So, from 1095 to 1291, the Roman Church launches a number of crusades to take back Palestine, especially Jerusalem, from the Muslims. The Crusaders did not just fight Muslims, however, they murdered many Jews on the way, destroying their communities. They even sacked the city of Constantinople, which, of course, remember, those were the Eastern Orthodox Christians, which they considered to be such heretics that I guess you could destroy their cities and take their things. And they were also dispatched by the Pope later to destroy communities of Christian heretics and other political enemies. So I won't tell you the whole story of the Crusades, but there were four major ones. The first one was somewhat successful. Jerusalem was held not quite for a century. But after that, they lost Jerusalem, and the Christians never got Jerusalem back again. They held on to some other places like Akko for a couple hundred years, but the Crusades were largely unsuccessful. But there were a lot more victims of the Crusades than just the Muslims that the Catholic Christians came and tried to wipe out to take back the Holy Land. When the Crusades were largely over, and sometimes while they were still going on, there were a number of crusaders, a number of holy orders that were actually dispatched by the Catholic Church to wipe out heretics. You've heard of the Knights Templar. These were the knights that were guarding. It was their stewardship to guard the temple mount, the temple area. And so that's why they're called Templar, Knights Templar. And of course, there's all kinds of neat, mysterious stories about them. But one of the things where they figure, and some other orders of knights figure too, is they're actually used by the church to stamp out heretics. There is a group of people in what becomes France, in the Albigensian region of France, called the Cathars, or the Albigensians. And some of them have committed the horrible crime of translating parts of the Bible into their own language. And they have made some different conclusions about what some scriptures mean than the official determination of the Catholic Church. And this kind of free thinking, this kind of publishing of God's word in pagan languages or whatever, this is of course punished by death. And so the church sends soldiers into the region, knights into the region, to find these heretics and stomp them out. Problem is, people aren't turning in their neighbors. They're not saying who did this, who translated this, who has been teaching this. And so since they can't find out who's actually guilty, they don't know what to do. The official edict that comes down from the Vatican authority that was over this: kill them all. God will recognize the ones that are his. This is where we get the saying, you may have heard it before. I've certainly heard it. Kill them all, let God sort them out. Sometimes when I was a kid, you'd hear people saying something like that regarding differences of opinion in other countries as to whether they're our friends or they're not our friends, and someone would say, kill them all, let God sort them out. This actually really, really comes from a decree of the Vatican, and that's what the decree was. Kill them all. Even the ones that you don't know they've done anything wrong, kill them all. Let God sort them out. Now, there's two things that go along with this. Number one, and the idea is that this sin is so great that even if many thousands of innocent people have to die, still, it is so important to get rid of this sin, to restore this land, to holiness, that, if these people have to die, they have to die. Secondly, if they were guilty of hiding something, well, they're going on their way to punishment anyway. But if they're not, if they were actually innocent and God knows that they were really his people and stuff, then God's not going to send them to hell. I mean, he's going to rescue them. He's going to take them home to heaven. So you can't really change someone's eternal destiny. all you're doing is really getting this person to heaven quicker. So in a sense, that's good. It's like you don't have to live through another 20 or 30 years of suffering in this life. We'll send you straight to heaven now. So the idea is it no longer really matters whether you kill a good man or a bad man, because God knows which ones are his, and if they're good, then he'll take them straight to heaven, and they're not going to have any problem with you sending them there. And if they're bad, then you're just doing God's will, because God was going to punish them anyway. This is one of the things I mentioned when we were talking about Augustine, is one of the ways that just war, I mean, this really kind of is some of the ideas in just war here that are being used, that the good to come out of this is so necessary, and so to be desired, that even if tens of thousands of innocent people have to die for this to happen, then oh well. So another case of this being used, the doctrine of just war being used in a way that I don't think Augustine ever intended. Thomas Aquinas, we're in the 13th century now. Crusades are pretty much over. This is the next really important theologian. In Catholicism, Augustine and Aquinas are the two great doctors of the church. And Aquinas is also very much loved in some forms of Protestantism. Protestantism pretty much universally considers Augustine to be really important, and most of Protestantism considers Aquinas to be important, but it depends what parts. But Aquinas is a Dominican monk, and when he writes his great theological treatise, I mean, many volumes, it's huge, Summa Theologica, he is doing the same kind of thing that Augustine does, but he is syncretizing his theological ideas with a completely different school of philosophy. He has rediscovered Aristotle, and he is syncretizing his theology with Aristotle because he thinks Aristotle is closer than Plato. Now remember, Christian church up until Aquinas has just basically said, Aristotle's a heretic, he disagreed with Plato, Plato is like God's man for the hour or whatever. And so the church has destroyed a lot of Aristotle's writings. And the reason that Thomas Aquinas is able to get as many of the writings that are still extant, that haven't been destroyed, the reason he can come by so many of them is because the Muslims have been preserving them. The Muslims have considered the philosophy of Aristotle to be a quite worthwhile endeavor, and they have protected the writings. Some of them are lost, yes. But it's interesting, if you happen to be a Catholic or some form of Christianity that thinks very highly of Thomas Aquinas or considers his theological work, Summa Theologica, to be a major foundation in Christianity, just remember, you wouldn't even have this theology, at least not in the same form, if it weren't for the Muslims preserving the philosophy that really, really connected with Thomas Aquinas. Interesting. Now, even before Martin Luther, there were reformers who were persecuted and martyred by the church. Martyred is a fancy word for killed for your faith, for questioning the authority of the Pope, papal authority, and Catholic doctrines, and for daring to translate the Bible into languages other than Latin and making it available to lay people. Now remember, the whole New Testament's written in Greek, and the Orthodox Church is still using Greek, but like I said, the Roman Church has decided God's language is Latin. And so if you translated the Bible into any language other than Latin, you were worthy to die. If you disagreed with any of the Roman Catholic Church's doctrinal conclusions on things, you were worthy to die. There were critics of some of the doctrines and a lot of the practices in the Catholic Church before Martin Luther. The reason Martin Luther is usually seen as the father of the Protestant Reformation is because Martin Luther was the first guy that lived. And that's largely because the Prince of Wittenberg, Germany, would not turn him over to the Vatican to be tried. But there were some that came before him. There's one that's not on the list here, Jan Hus, who was very similar to Luther, but he was caught and tried and burned at the stake by the church. Here's some others who were horrible heretics to the church. John Wycliffe translated the Latin Vulgate Bible into English in the 14th century, and his followers were called the Lollards. He actually died before he could be apprehended and arrested by the church, and he was buried, but that wasn't good enough. The church actually they dug up his corpse and burned his corpse at the stake to be ritually martyred again. I know it seems like a crazy story, but there was something about that declaration that, we're burning him publicly, we're officially sending him to hell. It was like these rituals that were done by the church were thought to have so much power. And by the way, that's some of the things that these, well, reformers are having a problem with. This is sacramentalism, that the church has all this authority to pronounce people to heaven, pronounce people to hell, and that there are certain rituals and procedures you can do to actually receive certain blessings. And I mean, everything is down to a very sacramental type of religion. It's this idea that there's something you can do to make yourself more worthy of God's blessings, or something you can do to make God more likely to bless you. But again, translating the Bible into other languages was just anathema. You couldn't do that. So Wycliffe was burned at the stake. Unfortunately, he was already dead, so I don't think he felt anything, but it was a ritual act that needed to happen. Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, and he didn't even use the Latin text to do it. He went back to the original Greek text and translated from that. So that was worthy of death as well. But what he's most famous for is his 95 Theses he nailed to the door of the church at Wittenberg, Germany, on the hallowed evening, October 31st, the day before All Saints' Day. He specifically critiqued the practices of indulgences and veneration of relics. Now let's talk about this. We have already said that Martin Luther objected to sacramentalism, and we've talked a little bit about this. The idea that there's something that you can do that makes God more likely to save you or more likely to bless you. Martin Luther hates this. As a good Augustinian monk, he believes that, you can take credit for nothing. And so the idea that you can do something to make yourself more worthy, he completely rejects this idea. And this is probably one of the important ideas that lead to the whole faith versus works idea that we talked about in the covenant video a while back. And some of the ways it's misunderstood, though it was great for the time, I guess, but it's still misunderstood largely today by Protestants. Anyway, I want to talk about the practices of veneration of relics first. Venerations of relics. A relic is usually a body part of a departed saint. And the Catholic Church at this point thought that there was so much merit left in this body part because the saint was so filled with the Spirit that even being in proximity to, like, say, the hand, of a departed saint somehow bestowed some great merit upon you. There were cathedrals, entire cathedrals that were built to, house the hand of a departed saint or something like that. And on All Saints' Day, November 1st, the different relics that these cathedrals had and so on would be displayed, and people would come, to see these things. And again, the idea was that they would be blessed by being in proximity to them. So the whole idea that somehow these body parts store up like kind of supernatural power in them or merit in them is something that certainly Martin Luther doesn't agree with. But one thing he really doesn't agree with is what's called the sale of indulgences. Now, the word's counterintuitive to us. What you're selling when you sell an indulgence is you're basically saying, this is a get out of hell card. This is a get out of purgatory card, if you will. At this point, we have the doctrine of purgatory. It comes from the word to purge, because not everybody that's unworthy of heaven should go straight to hell and be tortured forever. There are some people that maybe they're not worthy of heaven, but after a period of time in purgatory where they're being purged of their sins, at that point, then maybe they will be worthy and they can go to heaven later on. But, they're not worthy to burn forever. So the idea of creating purgatory, it is really kind of a merciful creation, because we start thinking of God as a more righteous God. So it's, if you're a Protestant, try to rethink it that way. Purgatory is not necessarily a bad thing. But the idea that you can somehow pay the church and get a piece of paper that guarantees you won't go to hell, or guarantees that, somebody else that you love, maybe your mama was a streetwalker, but now you can pay money and get your whore mama out of hell after her death. So why is this happening? Well, first of all, let's go back to the fact that the church has the authority to do this, to determine who's saved and who's not. The church has all this authority. They are really kind of the mediators of all of this divine merit. Now, where does all the divine merit come from that they're mediating and deciding who gets it? Answer, the departed saints. Because all of these people that were, concluded as saints, that did miracles and that are now prayed to and everything, they apparently accrued so much merit in this world that it only took a very small part of that merit to, get them to heaven, because they were just such superstars. And all the rest of that merit stays behind, and the church controls it. The Catholic Church controls it. And they can decide what to do with this merit from the departed saints. So what they're doing is they've run out of money, and this is a great fundraising operation. I think that they're actually still working on St. Peter's Basilica. For a price, you will get an official declaration that you will not end up in hell forever, or that your time in purgatory will be lessened, or that somebody that you loved will, after a time in purgatory, finally make it to heaven, and you're paying for this. And people are willing to pay for this. And there's a couple of reasons. First of all, they've really, they've had it programmed into them for centuries. The church really has this power, and they believe it. And number two, they're scared to death of hell. Jesus is not nice anymore. If you just look at the way art has changed over the centuries, he's not this, holding the lamb that went astray that he's bringing back to the fold. Now he's up on a throne with this remarkably, stoic, perhaps frustrated look on his face, and all the cookie cutter, saints on each side of him as he's looking at the book to see if your name is in the book, and if not, you're thrown into hell. So, yeah, Jesus himself just really is not, he's not your best friend anymore. A lot more people are praying to Mary on a regular basis because she's seen as being a little bit more compassionate. Maybe she can, maybe she can talk to her son, and, he won't throw you into hell. This is the state of mind that people are in. So they're scared of hell. They believe the church has the authority to grant them this reprieve, and so they're willing to pay good money for it. And this is going to happen on November 1st, on All Saints' Day. The relics are going to be venerated, but also representatives of the Vatican will be there selling indulgences. So it's the night before October 31st that Martin Luther tacks his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. These are 95 separate statements of disagreement with the doctrine and practices of the Catholic Church. It starts a whirlwind. It's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, and it goes many directions from there. Again, Martin Luther survives the wrath of the Catholic Church only because the Prince of Wittenberg protected him. He has a counterpart, if you will, named John Calvin. John Calvin is a Frenchman, but he's the leader of the Protestant community in Geneva, Switzerland, just as Martin Luther was in Wittenberg, Germany. John Calvin is the father of what we call Reformed theology, also called Calvinism, which revitalized Augustine's doctrine of predestinarianism fully, the way Augustine taught it so many centuries before, over 1,000 years before. So when we talk about Calvinism, we mentioned it earlier in the course on two separate occasions, if I remember right. This is this reinstating of Augustinian predestinarianism by John Calvin. And this is going to be important because we realize there is another 16th century theologian whose name is Jacobus Arminius in the Latin. It's where we get Arminianism, and he doesn't believe in complete predestination. He does believe in foreknowledge, but he does believe that humans do retain some power from God. God still gets all the glory, but every human retains at least enough of the Spirit of God in them that they can make a choice to give their life to God and accept this transformation. And so we've talked a little bit about the difference here, and most people see it as a free will argument. Do you have free will, or is your will bound, requiring some kind of a miracle to set it free? If you're saved, are you always saved? I mean, can you lose it? I mean, if everybody's predestined, you're not gaining and losing and gaining and losing. You are who you are, even if you may not realize it at the time. Even if somebody who's saved doesn't quite look like it, or somebody who looks very saved actually isn't very saved, whatever. The fact is, nobody's really changing in Calvinism. But in Arminianism, you make a choice, and you have to continue to make the choice. If you change your mind, you certainly can lose your salvation. So there's some major differences there. And again, we talked about them a little bit before. The Anabaptists were persecuted by Catholics and Protestants alike because they rejected the practice of infant baptism. Now, this is interesting. Baptism, I mentioned before in one of the videos, and communion, Holy Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, have changed so much over the centuries that I just don't even have time to talk about it. But suffice to say that at this time in history, babies are being sprinkled, okay? And this is baptism. It's kind of more of a dedication. But the idea of dunking an adult who's making a decision for Christ underwater, it's just not done anymore, even though that's the way it is in the Bible. So there were some Protestants that broke away from John Calvin's church in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland, over the issue of baptism, and they wanted to baptize people like was done in the New Testament. A person of age to make a moral decision, choosing the right thing, and therefore being baptized as an adult. Now, here's what you might find hard to believe, but both the Catholic Church and the Protestants under John Calvin hated this, hated it. I mean, Calvin had obviously rejected a whole bunch of the beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church, but sprinkling of infants in baptism was not one of the things that was rejected. And so both John Calvin, and some other Protestants and the Catholics persecuted the Anabaptists. Why do we call them Anabaptists? It means that this sprinkling as a baby that we're calling a baptism is not sufficient. You have to make this adult decision and be baptized like you were in the Gospels. This sprinkling as a baby is not sufficient. And so you've taken a major sacrament and said it means nothing. The irony is, of course, that Protestantism is supposed to be rejecting sacramentalism too, but they're just as offended over this as the Catholic Church. And there are actually times in the midst of a bloody war between the Catholics and the Protestants where they would temporarily just have a truce so they could both destroy an entire community of Anabaptists. They both hated them so much. So the second part that you might find hard to believe is if you're going to a Protestant church today that has a baptismal that dunks people in the front of the church, or you take them down to the river, or you take them down to the bay or something like that to do baptisms regularly, you might see someone like John Calvin as a great, father of the Protestant movement. You might like a lot of his doctrine or something, but if he saw you being dunked in the baptismal, he'd put you to death for it. Fun fact. Now, maybe not the same way as the Catholics. The Catholics might burn you at the stake. Protestants had more of a sense of humor, I guess. It's like, oh, you want to be immersed in water? We can do that. And they'd hold you down for about 20 minutes, Let's see if he survives this baptism. So, strange times. But that's what Anabaptists were. They were the ones who reinstituted the idea of adults being completely immersed in water when they are responsible to make a decision. Some people say you can make the decision at 10. Some people say it has to be 15, but age of accountability. And so today there are a lot of people that are being baptized by immersion. And in a sense, Anabaptists kind of opened this whole thing up again. Birth of the Church of England. Henry VIII, famous king, wanted a divorce from his wife, Catherine, who had failed to give him a son to be his heir. And the Pope at the time would not grant him the divorce, would not grant him the annulment of his marriage so he could marry the other Boleyn girl. And so King Henry VIII said, okay, well then we're going to start the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And, he just said, I'm the head of the Anglican Church on earth, and just created this whole new church separated from the Roman Catholic Church. Hey, if you don't give me what I want, it's like, I'll make my own church in my own country. That's the birth of the Anglican Church. Now, if you follow English history at all, maybe you watch the award-winning movie Elizabeth or something, and you learned about Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, trying to make peace between the warring factions of those who wanted to return to Catholicism, those who were, steadfastly Protestant. But there were a lot of people who just differed about what the Anglican Church should be like. I mean, should it have the same kind of liturgy and the same kind of practices as the Catholic Church, even though it's something different? Or should it be more like the Protestant Church that relies more on inspired preaching and the services and stuff? Well, a lot of people had differences of opinion. Some people wanted the Church of England to be more like a Protestant movement. Some people wanted the Church of England to be more Catholic. And there were some that wanted the Church of England to actually rejoin the Catholic Church. So those are probably your three major camps. But there was quite a bit of conflict over a few different monarchies. But anyway, that's the birth of I just want you to know the birth of the Church of England. Here's John Wesley. Founded the 18th century movement in England called Methodism. He didn't intend to separate from the Church of England originally, but this was the eventual result. This movement embraced the theology of Arminianism. Remember we talked about Jacobus Arminius, the Dutchman, that stressed each individual's free will to make a decision for Christ, and this is against the doctrines of Calvinist predestinarianism. Wesleyan churches, and Methodist churches especially, the biggest denomination that comes from John Wesley, is the Methodists. He called his followers Methodists. But they're probably the most purely Arminian of the Protestant denominations that you've probably experienced in our country. And some of the most Calvinist are, well, the Reformed Church, Presbyterian Church, are the most likely to be fully Calvinist. And there's some other opinions too, but that's a major one. We talked about this paradox of, like, you know, God's in control of everything and sovereign over everything, then obviously I have no will, and yet I'm required to make a decision of will to be saved. And we talked about this a number of different ways. This is kind of like the ongoing major paradox in terms of, you know, how salvation works. There's a lot of other things that we could talk about. I wish we had time, but if you have any questions on anything I haven't covered, please, you know, talk to me, send me an email, something. I'm more than happy to discuss anything that you would like to know more about. All righty? All right. See you next time.